So thank you, Raquel, for joining us for this interview. So my name is Yoriko Yasukawa. I'm the Vice President of the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability, FOGS. And this is an interview for our online magazine called Catoicos. And I should first introduce you. So you are a Costa Rican political scientist, currently doing your PhD at Oxford and doing some field research in Argentina. So you're joining us from Buenos Aires. But you also come from working as in public service, in public administration, in your own country, including, I understand, in the Ministry of Commerce, and also internationally, for example, at the OAS as a political analyst and as an advisor to the Secretary General of the Ibero-American Summits Secretariat. But if I miss something really important, please feel free to.
No, that is a good summary. I worked for the first job I ever did was for the presidency of the Republic.
Okay.
Then I also worked at the Ministry of Foreign Trade. Those were like my two stints in Costa Rican public service.
Okay, great, thank you. So if it's okay, we'll go right into the questions. So for I think most of our readers and audience who don't know Costa Rica well, I thought that it would be good to start with a little introduction of the country and where it is right now. And we I did want to talk to you about the recent presidential elections, both because it's an interesting phenomenon in itself, but I did want to get your views on what happened more as an expression of broader trends, both in your own country and globally, in terms of what's happening in democracy in the world. So Costa Rica is seen as an exceptional country in many ways. It's a small country in a region torn by civil war, plagued by military dictatorships, way into the 1980s, that has maintained a stable and robust democracy without an army for over 70 years, a country that has achieved exceptionally high levels of human development despite relatively modest income level. It's a pioneer in environmental sustainability and so on. Yet, all these achievements seem to be recently under stress and under threat, both for economic and political reasons. So as a Costa Rican citizen and a political scientist who's also had experience in public service, how do you see where your country is now? What is happening right now and why?
So I think that it's become a bit of a cliche to say that countries are fragmented, societies are fragmented as an explanation for things that's hard for us to understand. But in this case, I think it's generally true that the main feature of the Costa Rican society is its divisions. There are important fractures, socioeconomic fractures, but also generational fractures, geographical fractures, and cultural fractures that don't replace the usual cleavages, like the left-right axis, but actually get superimposed on that. So it's a very complex matrix of different cleavages that end up making extremely hard to build a common framework and a common political project. And these distances, I think, reflect very different expectations about what we want from the government, what we want from the collective, from society, what we want from each other. And increasingly, we're talking very different languages. And so part of this is a consequence of just an unequal trajectory and the inability of the country to be more inclusive, not just in economic terms, but also in social terms. And you have a country that has a fifth of its population that does not have access to adequate food and shelter and very basic needs. And then another fifth that gets up in arms over taxing of Netflix subscriptions. And so trying to build a political project that actually caters to the collective becomes increasingly hard. Added to this, something that we see pretty much across Latin America, which is the continued withdrawal from public services as citizens' incomes rise. And so there are very little things that we all share as Costa Ricans. Certainly not the public health system, not the public education system, not the public transport system. That is not where we meet. Increasingly, we only meet in the areas that are actually the most frustrating ones. Bad infrastructure, fear of crime, and our dissatisfaction with the political system. So what unites us are the negatives. And increasingly, the actives are actually things where we are fragmented. And so this way, it's increasingly hard to build a project. And what we have is just minorities fighting each other. And this gets reflected in a very fragmented political system with many veto players. Options have like multiplied in terms of like political parties and movements and etc. But it gets then increasingly hard to implement any one project. There are other constraints as well. We have very limited fiscal space. This is true across the board. It's particularly true of Costa Rica. It's one of the highest deficits right now in the region. There are legal hurdles, a very complex legal system where it's hard to come up with solutions and implement them, kind of frustrating. And then public approval has become quite elusive. People are very disenchanted, and so it becomes very hard to get sort of the political traction to move the needle in any which way. And of course, when the system is characterized by its constraints, what you need is extreme powers of negotiation and strategic thinking, which our political class isn't exhibiting particularly well right now, but also our population isn't exhibiting particularly well right now. What we observe instead is a tendency to maximize the demands from the different groups in the political class and in society, and seeing political pacts, political negotiation, political agreements as something that is untrustworthy, wrong, kind of treasonous, and in general, like a way that shouldn't be done, like a way that politics shouldn't advance. And so it becomes very hard to change the status quo. The status quo is no one's preferred option, but we just don't seem to agree on where to move. And so we just deteriorate in our current status quo. And it is hard to see what might shake the system into moving to the next square. So yeah, fragmentation, stalemate would be, I guess, the two main characteristics.
No, it's very interesting what you say about where, you know, the spheres where people meet are spheres of dissatisfaction and disgruntlement, you know, which probably is true of in many other countries as well. And that's really very sad, given, you know, so much that Costa Rica has accomplished in terms of public service and public good. And instead of defending that together, that people are, you know, fighting each other over how badly these work. Yeah,
I think we do draw some positive energy from things that are public goods and that we have built collectively. Definitely the environment, national parks, our ability to have actually built a network where that is actually public access is something that is hard for us to attribute to our political system. But oftentimes it's because we lack the comparison. Anyone who's traveled places where that is not the case, where there has been either because of the kind of development and deterioration of, or because it's privatized, I think sort of understands that we have a lot to be thankful for, and places where we meet and we draw actually positive experiences from, but we have a problem attributing that to decisions that we made politically. We think that these are just endowments. And it is hard for us to think that we had a part as citizens in building that space.
Right. So getting to the presidential elections now. So it resulted in the surprise victory of Rodrigo Chavez, who is a former World Bank official, who is almost a complete outsider to the political system in Costa Rica, over a former president, Jose Maria Figueres. And concerns have been expressed about comments by Chavez and his allies questioning the legitimacy of the democratic institutions in the country. And some observers have also warned of possible authoritarian tendencies on Chavez's part, which might lead to actions that could undermine democracy in the country. So how do you see the results of these elections? Are these concerns warranted? And what are the implications for the future of the country?
Well, I think that the result was a long time coming, not this specific person, but that conditions were set for an outsider has been a constant warning from political scientists and political analysts for quite some time. Which were these conditions? Like, first of all, a massive process of political de-alignment and deterioration of partisan identities. 30 years ago, which is nothing in political terms, almost all of the Costa Rican electorate identified with one of the two dominant parties at the time. Now it is less than 20% identifies with any of the political parties, which have mushroomed. So we have a multiplication of the offer of representation, but a very fast deterioration of representative linkages. And so this makes, of course, the electoral process highly volatile, highly uncertain, and it turns contingency into the norm. Everyone is always polling below 20%, and so everyone stands a chance. This didn't used to be the case. So the fact that this is sort of the structural space where we now go into elections makes it a lot more likely that any outsider has a standing chance in the second round. And it's because the second round is also something that we first had in 2002, and now it's like a mandatory stop in our electoral process, right? Because of the same political fragmentation. So you just need a very small edge now to land in the second round. Added to this, the continuous sort of dissatisfaction with the political class, the lack of prestige of the establishment, in general disaffection of citizenship, which gives you an electoral bonus if you're an outsider. Like right now, having a foot in the establishment is a liability. Coming from nowhere is an active. So like it's an asset. So already someone with like mildly, acceptable conditions has a fighting chance. And there's also this, I think Chavez in particular had the sort of, the juncture was particularly good for him. The structure was there with the lack of partisan identities, with the fragmentation, with the citizen dissatisfaction. And then he's running up against one of the most unpopular figures of the most established establishment. And he is able to reunite two large groups that until now hadn't been able to unite against some of the outsider figures that we had before. The people that are looking for an expert technocrat with no political color or ideology, apparently at least, that are very concerned about the economic state of the country, and they just want someone that has some form of technical pedigree to come and fix this because they see it as a sort of a management problem. And then the people who are extremely angry and wanted someone to come and bang the table. And those two groups actually hadn't met before in one of the outsider candidates. We had someone like Juan Diego Castro, who definitely catered to the banging the table constituency. We had other like technocrat figures that catered to like the people who only think about the economy as sort of a management problem. And until now, we didn't have a figure that could combine them. With a rival that is detested, like has the most anti-vote in the country, and then a prevailing sort of permissive environment of lack of gender awareness, misogyny, etc., that allowed for a large segment of the population to dismiss the allegations and actual like sanctions of sexual misconduct on the part of Chavez. That Plus, the dissatisfaction has generated growth in abstentionism. So this is something that the political scientist Vargas Cugelo always says, is the political country is actually smaller than the country, period. And so the pie of voters is smaller. And the ways in which you talk to them were particularly beneficial to a figure like Chavez. So I think, again, conditions were set, and there's a risk of overreading into his victory. It is very clear to me that the populist, more aggressive, more worrisome statements that he made, like the attacks on the press, the casting doubt on the electoral process, catered to the angry mob. And of course, the people who wanted the expert didn't care enough or weren't worried enough, because they believed that technical capabilities make you sort of already past being particularly, damaging. They were more concerned about someone like Villalta because of his ideology than someone like Chavez because of his lack of institutional commitment, or at least apparent lack of institutional commitment during the campaign. Now, he has definitely changed the tone after he won. There's definitely more moderation, signals and gestures indicating that he's much more willing to act within institutional pathways. This, of course, is very welcome. It is very hard to know if this is genuine, if it stems out of conviction, or if it's tactic. He is arriving in a position of extreme weakness. He was voted by less than a third of the electorate. And we know from polling that most of those voters actually just didn't want Figueres. So his mandate is weak, and he knows it. He's got less than a fifth of the legislative seats. And he's got a team that, at least from what we've seen so far, is expert in their fields, but they have no history of working together. They have no history of working with him, and they were not part of the platform. So none of the proposals were actually crafted by anyone who's going to be in charge of implementing them. So the challenges are up ahead. And I think the real test is not this moment where, we're all talking pretty. The challenges are when frustrations hit. When the first project that he deems important does not get approval in the Legislative Assembly, when the first project that he deems important gets blocked in the judiciary, I think then is when we're going to see his true colors, which I hope are more democratic and more institutional than what we saw in the campaign trail. For everyone's sake, it's better for him to have done that, which already shows not a lot of respect for institutions if you're willing to gamble that in your discourse on your reaching power, but it's certainly better to have done that strategically or tactically than to have done it out of conviction.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you say, that that he's managed to bring together this people with a technocratic preference with the angry people, and the possibility of his discourse being merely tactical, because when you look at his platform, it's very sort of managerially focused and tinkering with administrative processes rather than anything particularly ideological.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a part of the country, this is of course a generalization, but there are some people in the country that believe that we're just lacking some form of entrepreneurship mindset when it comes to politics. I'm much more of the feel that this is more like management of conflict. Like it's you need to. It's not just about divvying up the pie. It's about authority and legitimacy and fairness and things that are not just sheer management. But there's this perception of one segment of the electorate that believes that we should just run the government like a private company and be more efficient. And I think that he appealed to that segment quite straight.
Right. I actually also saw that. I come from many years of working in the United Nations system, and I think this sort of this business discourse has taken over the public sphere in general, both in at the national and international level. So we begin to do things in the UN also talking about clients rather than partners or citizens, and I find it actually very disturbing, because I think it is it does kind of deviate from the principles that should be governing what we do as public institutions.
Yeah, I also think it's a mirage. Like, in the end, we have limited resources, and it is not just going to be a matter of efficiency. A lot of it is going to come down to legitimacy.
Right.
Who's going to bear the brunt? Who's going to pay the bill? Who's going to do the sacrifices? And for what purpose? And those things are not just like, a matter of flowcharts.
Right. And I would think there have to be also ethical foundations for that argument, right? I mean, who gets more, who pays, and what's fair. So this declining trust in political parties and public institutions, and in fact, I think declining trust in general, when you look at, for example, that the global survey that these people, Edelman do, it's trust in general that seems to be declining worldwide. And it seems to be a global trend. And with that also this rise of populist leaders on the strength of this discourse that attacks existing democratic institutions as dysfunctional, as corrupt. And when you look at surveys like Latino Barometro, you see support for democracy uniformly going down in the region. So do you think that what is happening in Costa Rica is part of this global phenomenon? And what do you think well, you've already answered, part of this question, but looking at it, I suppose, more globally, what do you see as the elements in this erosion of trust?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a global trend. Costa Rica is just not an exception. Trust is, in general, like the philosopher's stone of politics. Like, if you have that, you can turn it into so many other things. It is the premise for legitimacy, the premise for willingness to cooperate, to engage in political agreements and negotiation, without which no political process ends anywhere. So the lack of trust is actually the main thing preventing us from moving out of the status quo, right? There are many studies that try to get at the determinants of this, like, loss of trust. Things that are somewhat obvious: corruption is linked to lower levels of trust, poor performance of state institutions, poor public services, in general, inequality, both vertical in terms of income and horizontal in terms of like groups in society. So whenever citizens are confronted with this evidence of essentially bad government, they end up losing trust. In the case of Latin America, we also have the effect of crime and insecurity that has seriously damaged our interpersonal trust as well. And it's toxic to, in general, our ability to buy in any kind of collective endeavor. And so we know that citizens trust governments that are responsive, that are open, that are transparent, that are fair, systems that allow them to participate and be heard. Even that itself, like, just procedurally, is important regardless of the outcome. And of course, they get angry whenever they hear about behaviors that are unethical, that are corrupt, that are unfair, that are exclusionary. And we have seen a multiplication of the avenues by which we learn about these behaviors that are unfair and unethical. So I think a big part of it is that we now have more light into this. Systems have traditionally been corrupt. We now know much more about it. Also, some of these alarms are a signal of the system at least trying to improve itself. It's very hard because there's a trade-off, right? the more effective you are at punishing corruption, the more people are going to perceive that their class is corrupt, because they're going to see the cases, they're going to learn about it, they're going to become indignant about it. But of course, sweeping it under the rug is not going to solve the problem. So there are growing pains of improving governance and government, where we run the risk of losing the public, of losing their trust, of losing their buying. So it has to be done very carefully, and no one really has figured it out quite well. And then there are things that have actually worsened. So there's more awareness, that's an element, but some things are actually worse. Not in Costa Rica as much, because inequality has mostly just remained stagnant or declined very little. But in other countries, inequality within country income inequality has skyrocketed. And then there's like the super rich, and all of those things have actually gotten worse. So, and we know about them. So there's the perception, and then there's also the actual material reality of some of this unfairness getting worse. And so the loss of trust is kind of a rational response to the information cues you're getting. There are many like initiatives and movements of regaining trust. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has a whole laboratory devoted to it. The IDB yesterday released a report on it. There are organizations all over the world working on this. So I have hope that we're at least reaching a point where we know there are some interventions that work. We know that more open access, more access to information, improvements in public service that are like targeted, strategic to the areas where people are particularly frustrated or where the stakes are very high, like health. Those things have ripple effects and are quite important. So I think we're in a process of learning how to address this, and just positioning the topic of trust, I think, has been a major achievement of the last few years.
Right. So could you give us some examples of things that have worked or could work both in Costa Rica and in the world? You have said that citizens must engage more in politics. And yet, as you said, absenteeism was at a record high in these last presidential elections. How do you motivate citizens to engage?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand that people engage or disengage for very different reasons. And so any strategy to get them to engage must be multifold. Some people disengage because they lack the resources, the time, the energy, the money, the attention span to engage. And so unless we address those, tendencies, those exclusionary tendencies, then it's asking too much of people to just also, cast aside some time to come and join the community board and etc. There are some people who disengage because they just think it's remote, it's irrelevant, they think it's boring. And so those people, you need a different strategy for those people. And then there are some people that just feel completely unrepresented. Like the party linkage thing is something that people are just repulsed by in Costa Rica right now. And that's a major problem, because our democracy is based on parties. The way we aggregate demands and turn them into some operational platform is through political parties. So unless we do some effort to fix those linkages, or at least improve them, I don't think we will ever return to the times of my grandfather, who literally took a bullet for a political candidate. That's gone, and it's okay. Our populations have become more distrustful and more critical, and they want different sources of information, and they don't want to feel attached to only one brand, and that's okay. But we do have to offer them better political representatives. I have friends from abroad who tell me that they just feel that the political class in Costa Rica doesn't represent the talent they know in Costa Rica, and I have to agree. Honest, there are, of course, exceptions. There are wonderful politicians in Costa Rica, but many of us feel very disappointed at some of the options that we are being presented with. And we don't think it's representative of the talent that is in the country, of the vocation to help and to change things that is in the country. And that there's a part of that has to do with political parties being closed, being, extremely hierarchical, having a lot of trouble with renewing their ranks. And then there's the cost of engaging in politics, which in Costa Rica has risen quite sharply. So if you're a talented person, especially a talented young person, you're facing a pay cut with enhanced risks of being involved in some form of scandal that is hard to anticipate before you join. And then with very little conviction that you might actually achieve what you're trying to implement. So we have a problem in attracting talent to politics that is translating into this very bad connection between politicians and the electorate, which again, I don't think it's going to go back to its glory days, but it can certainly be improved and must be improved. Regarding abstentionism, the Supreme Electoral Tribunal did a study a few years ago that really dug deep into the reasons behind abstentionism. And basically what it found is that abstentionism rates are an expression of inequalities in the country. The people who abstain the most are lower income people, lower education people, people in rural areas, people in low skilled jobs. The only exception was the 1998 election, where the middle class abstained and then eventually flocked to PAC. But historically, abstentionism is just an expression of social and economic exclusion in the country. So we do have to address that. And if not, then we're asking too much of these people to come and join our political project that is not doing much for them. Then there's the youth, and that's a different problem. In general, we know, and this is not just true in Costa Rica, we're observing across the globe and in Costa Rica as well, that both the citizen disaffection and democratic ambivalence, it's not authoritarianism, it's ambivalence. It's the fact that democracy is worse for younger people. Perhaps because they didn't form part of the great struggles to gain democracy in the third way of democratization. For whatever reason, they are just less linked to the democratic process. We know from studies that the best predictor of voting is having voted. So voting is habit forming. We need to get in there fast, quick, and early. And I think we need very much more aggressive tactics and much more aggressive strategies to involve these people. We're losing people in the pipeline between school, high school, and then something happens there and we lose a lot of people. There's a lot of movements in student governments, and there's citizen effervescence in very young people. And then something happens between age 15 and 25 where we lose a bunch of people. And that is a place where we need to just really intervene. And I think it's going to require not just treating them as objects of this kind of policy, but as subjects, actually giving them platforms, giving them spaces in the ballot, giving them being heard, give their voices, their concerns. It is not just vote for me and the project that has nothing to do with what you're asking. It's got to be vote for me because I am doing something that you care about. And that linkage right now is a bit broken. We have a very tone deaf political party system when it comes to youth, with very few exceptions. And then on a personal note, I just have become increasingly convinced that we should make voting mandatory. In Costa Rica, the Constitution states that it's a duty, but there's no consequence for not fulfilling that duty. I think that we should be fined, perhaps not something prohibitive, because again, sometimes people don't vote because of socioeconomic exclusion. But I think that we need a system that reflects our shared responsibility in setting the course of the country. And that people don't think that by abstaining, then they're just not part of the problem. We are all part of the problem, and we need our political system to reflect that. So that is a personal sort of process of conviction I followed recently.
Yeah, I think I agree with you absolutely. Before I served in Costa Rica, I was in Bolivia, and it was mandatory. and people voted at very high rates. And I think it does make a difference. And I think what you're saying about youth is also really important. And it's in my own country, it happens, the just this complete lack of interest and knowledge of politics among young people. And part of it, and this will, certainly happen in Costa Rica as well, they see it as a business of older people because of the demographic change as well. They're just simply not important as an electorate as the elderly are. So, their views are, why should I? All they talk about is, how to deal with the older people. So, yeah, I think it's a really important issue, but difficult one too to deal with.
It is very difficult also because uh, the effective constituents of elected officials are the older generations because of the same problem, right? So you know that the people who voted you in aren't the people that you need to hear now in terms of youth. And so you end up continuing to talk about pensions. And the youth are like, I don't know anyone below my generation that expects to get a pension at this stage. Like they just feel that we're gonna be milked by the people who are voting. And so unless we manage to have constituency linkages where, the youth are actually people politicians have a stake in, it's going to be very hard because they're going to feel they owe themselves to people that have completely different demands and expectations, and sometimes get into actual contradiction of interests.
So changing topics a little bit, part of the mission of our foundation, FOGS, is to promote a global narrative, a different narrative of hope, of solidarity that can bring countries and peoples together to work together for a more inclusive and sustainable. Do you think this is possible in a world that seems to be increasingly defined by conflict, by fragmentation, and also the threat of destruction by climate change? And if so, if it is possible, what do you think needs to go into that narrative? And how do you think we can build a collective process of storytelling and sharing that can lead to that new narrative?
I think that is not only possible, I think it's essential. It's not easy, but there's no other way. Like precisely because the challenges that we face are catastrophic, we need to find a narrative of possibility. My former boss, and who's a role model, I think, to me and to many women in Costa Rica, Rebecca Greenspan, always says that pessimism is demobilizing. Basically, pessimism ends up being reactionary. It puts you next to the people that don't want anything to change. So if you actually are a progressive person or someone who's concerned about the state of affairs, you need to find a narrative of possibility. You need to find a language and a space of action that is of possibility. That means that you need to be much more receptive to hearing that sometimes people who are on the progressive side are, because possibility is in negotiation. Possibility lies in the management of the conflict. It will not disappear. We just need to find any bit of common ground. And so we need to find wording and attitudes and stances that are more open, more receptive, I think. And that doesn't mean not having very strong convictions. One can have very strong convictions and still have one's ears open. And try and come out of our bubble, like we are all sort of trapped in our confirmation biases, just want to talk to the people that like think exactly the same as us. That's not positive. That is not progressive in the end, because it will not actually change the course of things. Unless you are a majority, talking amongst yourself isn't going to change anything. So I think that, yeah, we need to have like a different language that is more open, and also an attitude of more receptiveness. I think we also need to be very careful of what we amplify. Like if we find bad examples, that requires, denunciation and etc. But we must also amplify virtuous examples any kind of inspiring example should get the kind of platform that bad examples get. But we know from like studies on social media, et cetera, that the traction that the negativity generates is not the same as the traction that the positivity generates. We are part of that. I mean, there are of course bots and like actual algorithms behind this, but we are all part of what we amplify. And I think also in our choosing of our leaders and the way we exercise our own leadership, like, do we empower people who are destructive or do we empower people who are constructive? If we are going to build a narrative of possibility going forward, this has to be on the hands of people who are actually able to build, not just to destroy, not just to criticize, not just to attack, not just to say the, the quip that is super sardonic and ironic and it gets everyone all the likes, but it doesn't do anything.
I think you're really right about giving visibility to positive things without, being
naive.
Yeah, exactly. And I found that working with the UN system, part of our role was precisely to highlight the possibilities in the countries that we worked in. And I remember speaking to a former Supreme Court justice here, and talking to her about what I admired about Costa Rica was its capacity for moderation, because in Latin America there's a great tendency towards the epic and the heroic and the extreme.
Dramatic.
And Costa Rica is kind of an exception in that people have a tendency to say, well, let's not go quite that far. And she said to me, well, that's really interesting. I never thought of it that way, but I guess that's a good thing, and yeah, I think people do need to see that things are possible. And yeah, another Costa Rican friend of mine said, it's a reasoned optimism is very, very important.
I think that we need to sort of fight the narrative according to which positive, being positive, is for dopes. Like it's not dumb to have hope. It's not intelligent to be cynical. And we are right now, I think, making these associations all the time. And you can be informed and you can be concerned and still think there's a way forward. That is exactly what we desperately need, for people not to minimize the problems, not to look the other way, to confront them and still be able to think about the future in a way that is not just catastrophic. I think it's an expression of intelligence, not the opposite.
So the final question, continuing on the issue of narratives. So right now, what dominates the news worldwide is the Ukraine war. And what I find very worrying is not only the terribleness of the war itself, but how the world talks about it. Is the dominant narrative seems to be, well, on the one hand, to send more military aid to Ukraine so that it can resist Russia or even win the war outright, and then on the other hand, to beat Russia into submission through sanctions. And so the solution being force, whether military or economic. And so this idea of a peaceful negotiated dialogue solution has somehow disappeared. Living in your country, which took the step to abolish the military, that renounces war in its constitution, and being from a country also that does that in its constitution, even though we have a huge self-defense force. I was wondering whether, as a Costa Rican, you see a role for Costa Rica to play in resuscitating a narrative of peace and really eliminating war as an option. And that was why the UN was founded in the first place.
this, as I told you, is definitely not my area of expertise, so you need to take anything I say with a grain of salt. I have always found that Costa Rica's moral authority when it comes to conflict and peace comes precisely because of how radical, how completely unconventional its approach to disarmament was. And we feel proud of this. I think that's one of the few areas where we actually come together. Even though there are always people that are like, oh, no, we're actually violent in the end because there's violence in the streets and there's violence, there's crime, and there's gender violence, and all of that is true, which is true across the board. But the feat of abolishing the military, I think we're mostly proud of it, and quite widespread proud of it. And we also feel proud of promoting dialogue and negotiated solutions to conflict. At the same time, I think we don't want to be seen as people who just are unable to get it, or that are naive, that would create a world order where people just get trampled on by the bullies. So I think that the way this gets solved, like this puzzle, this contradiction, like how do you do when you adopt a stance that is disarming, and then there are people who abuse their power, and how do you solve that, is the international system. It's the rules-based international system. And so right now, my one sort of hope is that actually that international system ends up being able to bring the parties to the table. I think that the war entering this more protracted stage, it's going to be very hard for this to be solved just militarily. Some form of negotiating position will have to emerge. It probably might not be pretty, because no one wants Russia to get anything out of this. It feels like rewarding a behavior that is completely unacceptable. And then probably some of that will have to happen in order for the conflict to end. So my answer is very unsatisfactory, is we need to trust the rules and the system, because in the end, that's what we have. It's the one thing I think that is not just naive, people should talk and not fight. It's like, yeah, they should actually adhere to an international rule system, which Russia has completely violated. This is a war of aggression. But there's always, even in wars of aggression, spaces for talks. There should always be spaces for talk.
Right. Thank you so much. This was really enlightening, really illuminating. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Likewise.
I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it as well. Thank you very much for reaching out, and we'll be in touch.
Yeah. And please, let me know when